Everybody should have a solid workbench. Some folks also need a welding table. I needed both, so I built this out of a free pallet rack, and it only took me about 10 hours. And it's portable. For 20 years, I have welded things in the most irrational and downright uncomfortable positions. Then last month, code compliance told me I had to scrap almost all of my building materials that were stored just outside my back fence. Out of the ashes of this tragedy, I was determined to make something useful out of this old empty pallet rack that now suddenly had no purpose. In this video, I'm going to turn all this into a welding table. The first step of this project was buying some heavy-duty casters on Amazon. By spinning this orange piece, you can adjust the caster to either sit on the rubber foot or the wheel. Since this pallet rack is pretty big, around 3 by 8 feet, I wanted to be able to roll it around my workshop, ideally with one hand. So I started this project by welding casters to the pallet rack legs. Here the pallet rack is upside down. This allowed me to prepare the casters and get them clamped in place. Then once the casters were lined up just right, I flipped the assembly over to weld them. With the use of a wet rag, you can protect the plastic and rubber parts from welding spatter that might otherwise melt them. Once the casters were welded in place on the legs, I assembled the pallet rack. This is a fairly easy job to do by yourself. Assembly is made simple by the tabs and the orange beams here. They fit into the leg assembly and practically fall into place. Then on the end of each beam there is a slider that locks things together by pushing this orange rod through the square hole here. Now that the rack was assembled and all the casters were in place, the whole workbench was much more mobile. That meant it was time to get the materials from the steel yard. I landed on these 6x2 rectangular tubes to form the bulk of the table. I had the steel yard rough cut them to 6-foot lengths. Then once I got them to my workshop, I squared up the ends with my horizontal bandsaw. Once I had nice square ends, I cut the first beam for the very end of the table. Because the length of the table was not perfectly divisible by the width of my rectangular beams, I had to cut some custom notches into the tubes to allow them to slide past these orange tabs. I traced the custom shape with a Sharpie and then transferred the tube over to my jaw horse to start cutting it. I used my angle grinder with cutoff wheels and eventually downsized to the Dremel tool for the finer work. After cleaning up the rough edges, the first tube was ready. Here I show how it slides into place. Because the orange supports bow slightly away from each other at the middle of the table, each rectangular tube needed to be a slightly different length from all the rest. This meant that as I built the table, I needed to keep track of which tube went in what place since they are all a little different. I managed this by punching numbers into each tube that corresponded to their position on the table. I'll show that in a bit here. For the rest of this project, I used scrap materials whenever I could. Here you see me working with some scrap sheet metal to remind you to click that little thumbs up button down there. Here are the punches I mentioned. I used them to label both ends of each tube. This turned out to be very helpful when I removed the paint from the tops of each tube in an upcoming scene. The tops of each tube lined up to form a nice flat work surface. I used the same tubes from the top of this table to make supports for the bottom. I wanted to put a shelf down here, so I had to do something to make the tops of each tube flush with the orange beam. This is what I came up with. I used my angle grinder to cut a small segment out of the ends of each tube. Once I had each of the lower tubes notched just right, they basically fell into place. Now I had a nice flush surface to add a shelf on top of. This is an old scrap of expanded steel left over from when I built my workshop. And now with this new shelf in place, I finally had a space to store a metal cutting miter saw that I've wanted for many years. This type of saw uses a hardened steel blade that forms little chips rather than an abrasive cutting blade that creates dust. This means you can cut metal without having to wear a respirator or having tons of ventilation to blow the dust away. I'll put a link to this tool in the description. If you want to support this channel, you can use the links below to buy stuff on Amazon. These links earn me commission for the sale of each qualifying tool since I'm an Amazon associate. Look at that beautiful cut. I took the tube steel you just saw me cut and added some rivet nuts. This serves as a hanging rack for my clamps. of which I have many. My previous welding rig was this old AV cart that I dug out of my neighbor's trash. Now that I had the big workbench shelf, it was time to transfer my welding tools to the lower shelf of the table and rehome my little AV cart. So out to the front curb it went. Goodbye, little buddy. So now I'm all done framing out the table, and I got most of my tools loaded up on the shelf down below. Now it's time to talk about taking the paint off these top members. And taking the paint off of them matters because it helps when you're welding things. Let me show you what I mean. Before I had this table, the way I welded most things was I had to ground the item, and then once it's grounded, you have to weld it, as you can see. Well, now that you have a welding table, it's possible to set the grounding clamp on the table itself, and then depending upon whether the surface of the table is painted or not painted, that changes how you can weld. This side's painted. As you can see, no dice. This side is not painted. And as you can see, it allows you to weld. The reason that is because the grounding clamp is an electrical continuity with this bar since there's no paint between them. On this bar with paint, this is not grounding the bar, therefore when you try and weld this, there's no electrical continuity. So it's worth my time to take the paint off the tops of these bars and then coat them in something that'll hopefully prevent rust. So now we're going to do that in one of two ways. Standard brake fluid costs about $30 a gallon. You can get this at your local auto supply store. If you coat the tops of these bars, it works like a charm and it's pretty cheap. The other option I'm going to use costs thousands of dollars. This is a laser cleaning machine. I made a dedicated video for this. I'll put a link to that video on the screen here. And if you're interested in buying one of these, I'll put links in the description on how to buy it. As a reminder, the tool links below earn me commission, so I thank you in advance if you use them. Let's start with the brake fluid. I use this plastic tray I bought years ago as a containment pan. I poured most of the gallon into it so I could simply soak the beams and let time do the hard work for me. 2 hours later. Here I flip the wet side of each beam up and use the same type of chainmail you would clean pans with. After a little gentle scrubbing, most of the work was done. Here you can see a simple rinse washes off most of the residue. For any beams that had a little paint left despite the brake fluid and chainmail, a quick palm sanding took care of the remainder. This may seem redundant, but trust me, the sanding went way quicker than it would have without the pre-treatment with brake fluid. To remove paint from the tubes with the laser cleaner is kind of self-explanatory. The machine does all the work for you. It's pretty hypnotic to watch, so I'll give you 20 seconds of soundtrack rather than my rambling voice. If you're enjoying watching the laser do its thing, I'll leave a link on screen to a longer ASMR video I made for my other YouTube channel. Now that all the tubes were paint-free, I hit them with a coat of WD-40 to prevent superficial rust formation. Not only does it make the top surface look pretty slick, but it prevents rust that would otherwise make grounding things a bit difficult. So I recently refinished this old vise. I've had this my whole life, and when I got the laser cleaning machine, I used that to spiff this thing up, give it a fresh coat of paint. I'd like to be able to put this on the table, but I really don't want to commit to putting it in a certain spot on this table because I like the idea of having a big open face in case I need to lay a big piece of sheet steel here. So I have this idea of how to make this removable. I think I'm going to take advantage of the gaps here on each beam and weld this to a plate so that it slides in and out and it's removable. So let's do that now. I used some 1/4 inch thick 5x5 inch angle iron to make the vise plate. This piece was $90, which was way cheaper than it would have been to buy a whole sheet and cut it down to size. This is my cutting jig for my Makita circle saw that has a metal cutting blade on it. This is pretty similar to the miter saw I showed a bit ago. No abrasive blade means no stinky dust. The downside of the hardened steel blade, though, is that if you get it jammed in a cut, it tends to break teeth off the blade, and at $63 a blade, that stings the pocketbook a bit. The blades last a long time if you take care of them, but on this circle saw, you are more likely to break teeth than with the miter saw, since the miter saw is stabilized by its own base. Here you can see a few broken teeth. That's going to cost me. After harvesting what I needed for the vise plate, I cleaned the piece up with my belt sander. Then I cut out a small rectangle from the same big angle iron. This rectangle acts as a slider guide. It fits just inside each tube that serves as the workbench top. Next, I welded the rectangular slider guide to the vise plate. The welds didn't have to be super big since they wouldn't really receive any stress. Now that I had a plate that slides into any tube on the table, it was time to mount the vise to the plate. I marked the holes with a thin profile marker. And then drilled the holes out with a step-up drill bit. Here I tightened two nuts against each other to make a surface for my jaw horse to grab onto. Then I cut the head off the two bolts that would be closest to the welding table. I used the nuts to adjust the amount that the bolt passed into the plate. I left it so there was a little bit of a depression that I could fill with weld. Then I used my angle grinder to smooth out the surface that would sit on top of the orange beam. I repeated the same process for both bolts that would be positioned right over the orange beam. You can see here that allows for the vise plate to sit flush on top of the orange beam without having nuts underneath. The last thing I did for the vise mount was weld a small section of angle iron to act as a stop so the vise wouldn't pull off the table unless you lifted it upward first. The wet rag protects the bolt threads from welding spatter. Now, as you can see, once the vise plate is in place, it can't pull out. This vise turns super easy now after laser cleaning the screw and adding some lubricant. As you can see, it takes quite a bit of force to get the tube to jump out of its place on the table. Here you can see how easy it is to move the vise from tube to tube on the table. This vise mount turned out so nice, I went ahead and made a second one. I picked up this little vise in a Santa Fe thrift shop about 6 years ago. This ball joint makes it super versatile at holding things like a third hand for welding. It's not very big, but it's perfect for detailed work. Now let's build something so I can show you how the whole setup works together. Here I'm showcasing how easy it is to move the vices. This is the same sheet of scrap I used for the thumbs up part. And the whole point of having removable tube steel like I made it is so that you can clamp things down to the table. You'll see that in a bit here. So that piece of flat stock is just to keep this sheet from vibrating when I'm cutting on it. And here you can see I'm clamping it down. And with the beams out of the way, the saw blade can pass down below the surface of the sheet steel without hitting any part of the table. Anyone who's ever cut sheet steel with a saber saw like this will know you gotta prevent vibrations as much as you can, so I'm wearing a welding glove and keeping my hand on the plate so it doesn't wiggle around so much. And briefly here you can see a magnetic base I can clamp down to the table to prevent the sheet from rotating. I have locking casters on my belt sander set up so that I can bring it outside and get all the dust outside rather than inside the shop. Here I'm just cleaning up the sharp edges on the piece I just cut. With my new Fandango miter saw, I can cut compound angles in 2 different dimensions. Here I'm using a magnetic angle holder to hold the pieces in place while I tack weld them. I use a weak acid solution to etch the surface of the metal. I don't show it, but I actually soaked each side for about 5 minutes here. And then after it's been soaking in weak acid, you scrub it off with a Brillo pad. This will get paint to adhere real well. You always want to prep a surface of steel with something like acetone before you paint it. Again, with the removable tubes on this table, I can put things with a downward projection through the table and it sits nice and flat. Here's the ball joint vise holding the rod so I can weld it in place. It took me about as long to make this as it did the table, so please remember to subscribe. And last but not least, I'm sure some of you are wondering if I can weld something way across the table when the grounding clamp is on the far side, if the electricity will conduct through the beams. I know I was wondering that, so the answer is yes, I can. So I'm basically done building the table. I think it's probably worth talking about some numbers. That's size and money. So the table ultimately winds up being, and I'm measuring on the beams themselves, 32 inches by 8 feet. All said, it cost me about $700 in steel. That's not cheap, but for a table this size, I would challenge most people to find anything this substantial for $700. That's actually pretty affordable in the world of welding tables. This is totally modular. I can move my vise, I can take out each and every beam, I can take off all the beams, I can break this whole thing down and put most of it in a standard pickup truck by myself. I don't need the use of a crane or anything like that to move this around. So profoundly portable, fairly affordable. I'm going to see how I use it. I'm pretty confident I'm going to love this thing. Sometimes I get comments asking the tools I use. I'll put links to these down in the description. As an Amazon associate, I do earn income on qualifying purchases, so I get a small amount of money every time someone buys something. The laser machine itself, yeah, this is so fun to use. It's an expensive machine. The price will probably vary over time, so I'm not going to say the price in the body of the video, because by the time you see this, that probably won't be the price. So click on the link in the description if you're interested in that. If you got anything of value from this video, I would ask that you please take the time to click the thumbs up button and the subscribe button down below. Those are really the main 2 ways you can help me support this channel. We'll see you on the next one. I don't understand. Oh, there you go. There you go. All right. All right. Can you follow me down? We're going down here. There you go. How do I hobble across the scene? A little bit like this. This makes no sense. Now that I've gotten all of my tools loaded up onto the new table, we're up here. We're up here. Oh, that. Look there. You're a robot, but you're doing okay, but not that good. All right.